Okay, so, David Hume, he's a Scottish philosopher from, I guess, the 18th century. If I remember right, I think he died the same year we declared independence here in the United States, 1776. I think he had a pretty strict upbringing, so, very religious, Calvinistic, right? So almost like, absolute, what do they call it? Mine just went blank. It's like the individual is simply total corruption. I was thinking. So he had this sense, at least in his own personality, of trying to prove God's existence. And he also, from a very young age, had a penchant for atheism. So you wonder, my experience has been, overall, I don't care what religion you're in, when somebody starts to really get into proving God's existence, you're not that far at some point from almost abandoning the faith. Because you inevitably will start asking questions as to, what proof counts. And if you want absolute certainty, it's not going to be the kind of proof that's going to work in a subjective experience like that. So maybe that has something to do with where he set off. Because he wanted to be a lawyer originally. So he sort of abandoned that and then got into philosophy. So nonetheless, he's an empiricist. Does anybody know what empiricism is overall? What's empiricism? What does it rely on for knowledge? Yes, right. Yeah, it's going to be experience, right? So you can see, okay, so if you're going to be the individual that thinks experience is the way for you to know the world, where would God, any sort of deity, fit into that scenario? It wouldn't. There was a lot, too, going around his time about the idea that, miracles, like in other words, some people will say, well, miracles are proof. So, you see stuff like in the movies and such, there might be like a film, heaven is real, and it show a young boy who shares all his experiences. But Hume would just dismiss that all. He says, you can't count any of that. It's all subjective, it's not based on anything empirical. So any, account of miracles and the supernatural, gone, right? So you would have to have something that's entirely experientially based. And I'm not quite sure what that would be, especially if you get a sense for where he's going with some of this. I mean, his whole penchant for cause and effect is going to totally throw that out. So let's see. Now, the first part actually wasn't really in your readings, but I thought since we didn't speak at all about Hume and his type of epistemology, that it was worth at least working this out. Okay, so he sort of started in doubt like Descartes, but not the same way. Descartes, I'm only going to I will doubt everything that's not certain. The only thing I'm certain of is that I'm doubting. So he starts there, right? Hume's going to almost accept, what's out there already. Remember, it took Descartes a little while to get there. He would start with mathematical proofs. There's some things that I can know, and then he eventually said I know that outside of reality exists, but only imperfectly. Well, Hume doesn't have that same method, but he's going to pretty much wind up at the same conclusion. He's going to sort of think, what's out there I can only know to a certain degree. So he starts this copy method of how somebody might know something. Like, we're going to talk about how he knows ideas and such. Tabula rasa, the blank slate. All right, so we sort of know, at least today, through neuroscience and elsewhere, that they're not blank slates. This was the idea. So the mind was totally blank, and experience will write things on that slate, and then you will have knowledge gained through those senses and experience. And it could be things that you internally put together, like your feelings and stuff too. But there always has to be something that happens in experience that's going to write itself on that tabula rasa. So what he says is, like, for instance, the color blue. The way that you and I know the color blue is somebody told us, right? When we were kids, they brought out colors and we pointed to it, and that was blue. And then that becomes an idea that is impressed on the mind of the human person. Now they have the idea of blue. Now you could do stuff with this, right? You can alter it, you can add it to other things, you can subtract it. You can do all kinds of things with the color blue, but his point is, you're not going to have an experience with that. So in other words, if you know what blue is, and you also know what an apple is, right? we really could put those two things together and say, hey, there's a blue apple, even though maybe nothing like that really exists. It's still something that Hume says we can come up with. But it's all starting from this blank slate. It's an experience somewhere. Now here's an interesting thing. Does a blind person know what blue is? What do you think? I mean, you can tell me what you think, but also tell me what you think Hume might probably respond. Can a blind person know what blue is?
I guess maybe Hume would say no because of the experience.
You would say it's impossible. To be honest, it'd be a little difficult anyway, right? I mean, how would you explain blue to somebody? Did you ever see those videos where somebody who has severe color blindness, they make special glasses and they put them on for the first time? Did anybody ever see that? The guy started crying because all he ever saw was shades of gray. And he puts it on, he looks around, and he didn't think it was real. The man was almost like, is that fake? You mean to tell me that that's what that looks like? That's green. So it isn't like they don't know colors, but they have to learn them intellectually, right? So you can't experience blue. Somebody can only try to explain it to you. But how do you explain a color? I mean, it gets very difficult. You could talk in terms of its very, maybe density could be something they can learn, intensity. You have to almost put it into those types of concepts. So somebody might be able to get it somewhat, but there's no way they're going to get it all together. And there's some other glasses now that I think are even more market, like what they call it, over the counter. Maybe not over the counter, but they're more accessible. Where I was reading about one college student who he's an art major, believe it or not, and I think he was in cinema, but he had a lot of problems because of his color blindness. So just his fellow students got together and did a GoFundMe for him, and they bought him these color correcting glasses. And you know what his biggest thrill was? He can dress himself. He actually knows what the colors he's putting on because he had no clue. So everybody always figured either somebody let it out when he was younger, or his mother, when he was in college, he didn't have anybody, maybe a friend, hey, come over, can you tell me, is this close? So this would be something that Hume would point out. Well, then how does anybody have this idea of color? I mean, we're kind of stuck at that point, right? Even if we can come up and say, well, these two things together gives a blue apple, it's still written there. Now, he doesn't, we're going to see a little bit later, I'm going to talk a little bit more about his, well, let's do this first. Maybe we'll just kick it right in. What's inductive thinking? I know we talked about this once before, but what would be inductive thinking as opposed to deductive?
So you make predictions about future based on the past experience?
Yeah, past experiences or whatever, right? So, somebody might say, well, okay, so in other words, it's based on the principle that you cannot have all the objects within a particular set, but you're still going to make some assumptions on what happens. Like for instance, well, I think I have one up here. I didn't know what the largest land mammal was. I looked it up. Does anybody happen to take a guess? I knew what it would be. I just didn't know exactly. What do you think is the biggest lumbering mammal on the earth? Not in the water, on land. Elephant, yeah. So this African, I think it was called an African, something elephant, largest land mammal on Earth. Okay, Hume would say, how do you know that? I mean, did you see every land mammal on Earth? No. Well then, how do you're saying you know that? Well, we might say, okay, but none of us are experts, right? So we rely on other experts. Okay, but did they see everyone? Is there some person that has seen every blessed land mammal and knows that they've seen every land mammal, and now they know that's it? No. So it's one of these things where nobody's ever seen anything bigger. So you can almost see like where the theory of falsifiability comes in. We'll accept that, until somebody tells us differently. Because why would we, we don't know of anybody that can tell us. There's nobody's going to stand up and say, oh, I got one. Because if you did, it would throw this whole thing out. So we don't really quite know what's going on. Oh, I did put an African bush element. There it is. Well, it's the same thing. Like you might read on the internet. I saw one yesterday. Oldest surviving World War II veteran, 110. Wow. But how do we know? I mean, does somebody have a list of them all? Has somebody checked that every single one that was alive is no longer alive? I mean, you might say this isn't really important information, but it's not. But we garner a lot of knowledge, at least from these particular things. The tallest mountain, the longest road. You guys ever watch Elf? Best cup of coffee in the world, right? I mean, how can you say something like that? That it never going back to Frankfurt's bullshit, right? I mean, how do you know that, right? So, this is his inductive method. So you can see how, if this is how he's going to approach things through this copy thesis, he's not going to have any particular way to keep a faith in a deity, a supernatural deity. Miracles, anything that would not be experientially proved is going to get discounted. This is also going to throw him, now, it's not that he was necessarily a skeptic, so it's kind of like, although he probably was, it's like, what can we possibly say then if we're going to use this? So, part of what we've been talking about in this course is that there are different types of knowing. And this empirical method, like he pulled this off of John Locke, a lot of this, is very important, but we would love this if it was a case study on some biotechnical, what do you want to say, experiment or something. But we would never bring this type of criteria into a relationship we have. And our relationships are very important. So maybe this isn't the only type of way of knowing, and if somebody says this is the most certain way of knowing, even then, we're really going to come down, we're going to see in the end, we're going to come down to probability. It's really, that's why I put up there, I doubt it probably. It's like, it really comes down to these are the only things I know, but I only know them to a certain degree. Some things I know better than others. But the most used analogy for inductive method is, white swans. All swans are white, so you've never seen a black swan. I don't know if there is. It's just something that's always been used. Well, unless you've seen every swan, how could you possibly make that sort of observation? Okay? But nonetheless, that's empiricism. Okay. Have we ever heard of Hume's fork? Okay. He didn't call it that, but others call it that. Okay, so first of all, forks have a tine. Those little the spokes on a fork are called a tine. This is not like an eating utensil. I doubt that you and I use forks with 2 tines, almost. So this is like think of a fork in a road. Okay, you got 2 ways to choose. And you come to this decision which way you're going to go. So the first one that he talks about is these relation of ideas. Now, ironically, the matters of fact are going to be the things that he knows less. So this is a little counterintuitive if you're hearing it, because you would normally think something called a fact would be the thing you know better than an idea. And he's saying, no, it's the other way around. It's the idea that you're going to know with more certainty than the fact, okay? Okay. So what he starts out with is this idea of a priori. Do we know what that means, a priori? Yeah, before experience, exactly, all right? So these are things that we can know before experience. So not unlike the philosophers that came before him, not unlike Descartes, he'll start talking about mathematical principles. The Pythagorean theorem, we know that prior to experience. We also know that the interior angles of a triangle must equal 180. We know that prior to experience. We know that a right triangle is going to have at least one angle with 90 degrees. We know that prior to experience. So this is going to be either something that we know or we don't know, okay? So this is why he's certain about it. Now, maybe that sounds obvious to you, and maybe it even sounds like, but this is something I've heard before. But his point is, in terms of reality, the fact that you know that a triangle has interior angles equal 180 degrees never is going to tell you if the triangle is really out there. It's not something, in other words, his point is this isn't the most useful information that one can come up with. So even if we know it certainly, it's not going to be telling us a heck of a lot about the world out there, right? So, in other words, 3 times 5 is 15, okay, perfectly fine. We know that's true, but that's something that we can know as far as an idea. And we could also know that 3 times 10 is not 15. I should have put the not equal sign, right? We know that that's not true. So it's like we know one of those 2 things. It's an either or. Let me see if this is a good place to talk about this without getting too deep into it. I'll wait a second here. Okay. So anyway, these relation of ideas, he just considers them operations of thought. He says these are things that you can know prior to experience. You will be certain that they exist or they don't exist. But unfortunately, they don't tell us a heck of a lot about reality. So it's sort of like, the sad irony, the thing we would know most certain is that thing they're probably going to use, not use the least, but at least need the least for our lives. Now, opposed to this is the observation of experience. As a matter of fact, let me go back one before I get into that. So that's what a posteriori means, right? It's after experience. So these are things that you can know once you have experienced them. But keep in mind that he still has the inductive method moving on here. Now, the problem is because there are observations and experience, and because that we can't experience everything, we're going to be limited here. So all we can really do at this point is assume that whatever we've experienced, if we've experienced it enough, that it's going to happen the next time. But there's never going to be any certainty to that. And I'll talk more about that in a second, so it's pretty clear, the connections on that. Now, I want to back off a little bit, because Immanuel Kant, there's some philosophers, by the way, that say that nobody's really figured out a way around Hume's fork, that this is life. We're never going to have that certainty between what we see and what we know of that thing, because our experiences can never be universal. Other people not so much. They think, no, we've made some progress. It just depends. Immanuel Kant tried to get around it, because when you know something prior to, like, okay, so there's a priori and there's a posteriori. Those have to do with before and after experience. But then there's the way that we can use language in talking about them. And you don't need to really know this per se, just something off. It's probably good you heard it. It's known as synthetic and analytic, right? So analytic are these things where probably what we need to know about such a thing is contained in the structure of the sentence. Let me give it to you in an easy way. This isn't all. Have you ever heard the word tautology? Come on, maybe you have. But tautology is almost like it doesn't give you any new information. So if I were to say in a sentence, all widows were once married, you'd be like, well, isn't that what a widow is? All bachelors are unmarried. Isn't that what a bachelor is? You don't need experience for that, right? But it's analytic. It's not really putting something together. It's looking at something, but it's not getting us new information. So how helpful is that? So the synthetic is when you're trying to put new stuff together, right? If we were to say, instead of all bachelors are married, all bachelors are tall. Now that would be a synthetic statement, because there's some new knowledge in there. But he says but see, Hume's point is we only ever know that by experience. I mean, if we were to try to make the assertion that all bachelors are tall, it'd have to be on all the experiences we've had. Everybody here who's ever seen a bachelor, they've been tall. And we've never seen a bachelor who's not tall. Forget about whether it's true or not, right? Because remember, the operation of thought, it's either true or false. So those are something we can know or we can know are not true. But Kant tried to say, could it be that we know something synthetically, a priori? And he tried to make the case for that. Depends on how well he did or not. How much he liked Immanuel Kant. But we're just going to leave it. I just want to let you know that, it's not an easy thing. If it sounds like it's simplified, what he's saying, there hasn't been a lot of progress with people really nailing this down and saying, look, here it is. Because Hume flat out said, look, if you're going to tell me, like, okay, let's go back to the African bush elephant. If somebody says, yeah, I've seen them all, then you need that person's testimony. And if somebody says, well, nobody's seen them all, but somebody, at least enough people together have seen them all, he's always going to question this chain of events. He goes, you can't just put chains together and expect all the elements within those chains to add up to give you the type of knowledge we're talking about here. So what we do is anytime a new drug comes out, right, they do enough tests on them to make predictions on what's going to happen in the future. But we're kind of stuck there. All we ever can do is say, it's happened all the time. We don't know when it hasn't happened. So it's probably going to happen again. But that's not good enough for him. It's one thing to say, the sun rises every morning. Oh, I'm going to say it this way. It would be good for him to say, he would say this would be an operation of thought to say, tomorrow the sun will rise or won't rise. Okay, because it is going to be one of those too. And we'll know for certain whether or not that statement's going to be true or false. But for somebody that said the sun will rise tomorrow, we can only base it on past experiences. Before you think he's getting too silly with this, let me explain. So let me use like a different example of the billiard ball, right? So if you and I had a billiard ball out of chest height, and we let it go, it's going to drop, right? We could do that 5,000 times, and it's going to drop. His point is, okay, so the cause is you releasing the ball, and the effect is the ball dropping. His point is, what's the connection between that cause and effect? Now, we can have all kinds of scientific theories of gravity and stuff, but that's not what he's talking about. What he's talking about is the opposite is conceivable. It's conceivable that it won't do that. Now, before you say only an idiot would think the ball's not going to drop, he concedes that. And he even says in there that a person may search in vain to try to show the opposites. But he says, but it's conceivable. And as long as it's conceivable, the fact that that ball will drop and hit is contingent only on our past experiences. We have no other way to really do it. Now, this is almost how science works. I mean, there's really no other way around it. I mean, there's only some things that we can say. If we say that this drug has always worked, like, okay, if we're using aspirin to relieve some sort of pain, and, you know, again, for, what, almost 100 years, they had no idea why aspirin worked. They only knew that it did. It was 1973 until they realized how aspirin reduced pain. So for almost 100 years, they figured out that give somebody aspirin, and they seem to be saying they have less pain. Everybody seems to be saying this. So let's just keep repeating it. We have no idea why. How many things do we do in life, or even in science, that we have no idea why? If you know anybody with multiple sclerosis, they don't know the origins of this disease. They don't even know what it's really caused, nor do they know how to treat it. They know how to treat it. They don't know why the treatment works. It just seems to work. People say it works. They have less lesions, and they have less, exasperations, but they don't know. But they keep going. So nobody would laugh at that and say, well, idiots. Why would you do it if you didn't know it worked? Because they don't know what else to do. It seems like this always happens, and that's good enough. But that's never really telling us why that effect led from the cause. And he's saying, then you don't have certainty, all right? All you're talking about, I'm calling them matters of fact because they're observations we're making in this experienced world, but they're not the same as the a priori that's going to tell us for certain that the interior angles of a triangle are always 180 degrees. I mean, that we know. And we don't need experience to know that, but once we bring experience in, then we're kind of stuck. And we're not going to really know what comes next. You might do this with your studying. Maybe you have found a good method to prepare for an exam. You have a hard time really trying to explain exactly how you do it, but it seems to work for you, and you're like, hey, it isn't broke, don't fix it, right? So you're trying to figure it out. But you don't really know what the cause and effect of these two things are. We don't even really know how we put this stuff into our heads, right? I mean, we kind of know it's not the tabula rasa, but we also, not everybody's real. You can see his difference from, like, the ideas of, say, Plato, right, or the ideas of Augustine, or the ideas of Descartes. You still see a difference here in the ideas, but for him, it's almost like this impression is made. And by the way, he does say that you can know things that you've never experienced. But you only know them because of the things you've previously experienced. For instance, I think there's like a book called Shades of Blue. So if there's some shade of blue that you've never experienced, you couldn't know that it exists. Say that again? Well, he would say no. He would say no. And the next part of this, I'll be able to explain that to you more. But he'd say no. All you know is that some cause happens and there's some effect. I don't know what happens in the middle, the medium, right? But let's go back to the shades of blue. If somebody, like, if you were able to lay out all the various shades of blue, whatever that might be, you might be able to see a gap. You might be able to say, I can conceive of something between, Prussian blue and powder blue or something. There should be something there. You've never experienced that, but I've experienced Prussian blue and I've experienced powder blue. So I know that there's something in between those. I can rationalize that. So it's not like he says you cannot know anything you can't experience. All he's saying is that if you try to pretend that you know something outside of experience, it's always related to experience. So nobody here, oh, maybe I should ask, has anybody here ever seen a unicorn? A real one? No. But we can take, are you thinking?
Yes. I'm confused.
You've never seen it? Okay.
No, not about that.
Okay, just checking.
No, you said you can know things you've never experienced through previous experiences.
Okay, so the only way that you can know a color blue that you've never experienced is that you've experienced other colors of blue. So if you can picture like a spectrum of blue on the wall, and it seems like there's a shade missing. Now you've never experienced that, but I can rationalize that from my experience of Prussian blue and powder blue. So knowledge still only comes from experience, but you can almost sometimes internally rationalize things that you haven't experienced, like a blue apple. You know, I've never seen a real blue apple, but I've experienced blue and I've experienced apples.
So so with that elephant thing, like that's the largest mammal, but how would you know if you didn't experience it?
Well, that's
Wouldn't he go against
okay.
what
Well,
he's saying here?
he's saying what we're doing is we're relying on testimony. So he's not saying that perhaps that's not true. He's just saying that we can have the same level of certainty with that type of inductive reasoning as we would with the a priori, as long as it's applied to say something like mathematics or something like that. You know, in other words, I don't need experience to tell me about the interior degrees of a triangle. I get it. You know, somebody tells me that that's the largest land mammal. Okay, you know, and I'm going to hold that as true until somebody tells me different, right? And this has happened, right? You know, like the Komodo dragons and such in the West, a lot of these things weren't thought to, like, you know, who knows, they really exist. Or how about giant squids? That almost seemed to be like something out of like folklore, right? Until they recognized that they were finding these huge squids. Well, that changes, you know, people's impression. Now we know that something else exists. So people talk about, does Atlantis really exist? Because, you know, the ancient philosophers talk about it. Who knows? Maybe it does. As of now, we say no, because we have no experience that tells it exists. So our experience is contingent on some future happening, that we have to let it there. So if somebody were to ask me flat out, can you prove that Atlantis exists? No. Is it possible that it could exist? Yeah. I can conceive the opposite, which is why, you know, even in inductive thinking, I can always conceive something in the opposite. With a priori thinking, you know, I cannot conceive. Either it is or it isn't. Either 3 times 5 is 15 or it's not 15. It's one of the two. There's nothing else there that I can conceive. So I have certainty about that stuff. But again, his issue is, okay, great, you have certainty about that, but it doesn't tell you a heck of a lot about the world. I mean, just because you know what the inside dimensions of a triangle are, the angles, doesn't tell you that a triangle really exists. You know, that type of thing. Anyway. Let me move on. If there's still, by my point with the unicorn is this. You know, we have ideas of animals with a horn, and we know what a horse is. Right? So we would talk about abstracting the horn from that animal, and then putting it on the horse. But we've never seen something like that. So we might say we have knowledge of that this thing could exist, but it's only because we've experienced other things. If we never experienced a horse, I guess at the Norwal, right? If we never experienced a Norwal, then we would have no way to do this. You know, we'd have to have something in between. There has to be something there for us to put these things together. All right. This might help, and if it doesn't, then we just have more. Oh well, let me put it this way. This is what it comes down to. We only really know the effect, and we know there's a cause, and we can't figure out how these two things are happening. What conjoins these two things? And I hope I'm not presenting it where it sounds like it's a frivolous argument. It's a pretty good argument. It's one of those things that if he'll say you'll start thinking about it, and then like he even like almost like calls people out. If you're going to tell me that there's a chain of events that are reasoning to believe this, then provide that. Show me this. And there's been people outside of them that really have shown the chain of events that can do this, and even today in the scientific community, we're still kind of stuck with this, right? We're going to say this is true until somebody falsifies it. It's the same way of saying that we know it produces this effect until something other than it does.
If someone like convinces us to like doubt what we did before, but we still like kind of circular experience ourselves we're supposed to believe them.
Okay, so would you say like if we thought it was true and they've convinced us to doubt it, how would they have convinced us to doubt it? What do you think? What would they have done? Oh, okay. Well, we would have to fall back on the Hume's position that we know that truth inductively. In other words, I'm going to accept it as true until, if somebody shows me a man animal bigger than the African elephant, then I'll change my mind. You know, so yeah, I mean, in other words, from Hume would say I have to have an experience of something different, whatever that might be. So whatever it is that we hold true, like, and this is also difficult for like historical figures too, right? So like a couple of friends of mine, again, after a couple of beers, they want to get edgy with their atheism, will say, well, can you prove God exists? Can you prove that Jesus Christ was a real historical figure? You have a hard time proving, according to their desired method. They never even like him as a figure. I mean, how do you do some of that?
I feel like for the relations between cause and effect is almost saying a logical fallacy. If A then B, and if we know B, it doesn't make A happen. Like we know if it rains, the road will be wet. And if we know the road is wet, we are not sure if it's raining outside.
Yeah, that's right. So you can't do the converse of those, right?
Yeah.
So if you study logic, sometimes you can't, like if all A is B, you can't say all B is A. You can't do that. So the example you use is a good one. It's often used. If it's raining outside, I think we could all just safely say the ground will be wet, right? But if we look outside and the ground's wet, would everybody here equally be safe in thinking that it had rain? No. It could have been the damn sprinklers that are going on. Sometimes you have to put a little car wash to get along the sidewalk, right? So that's what you mean. It's like this connection. That's right. Very good, right? So it's like we have always this issue. Sometimes all we see is, the ground that's wet. And in the past, in other words, okay, if we would go back in time, like before sprinklers and everything else, depending, we'd have to be careful with this. If we saw fields wet, we probably could, convey the thought that it did rain. Because there'd be no other way. There's no technique or mechanism, 1,000 years ago to make 20 acres wet. We wouldn't have known that, right? But today, we would question this. So just because we see something doesn't mean that that's how it came. Now, he goes even a little bit deeper in something like this. Because he's going to start questioning, what exactly is this connection? And this is how unsure he gets about it. And maybe after this will at least hopefully help make sense of it for you. Okay. Now, you know how bad it is when you see that and I get hungry? I see a piece of clip art with a bread and steam coming out of it and I get hungry. This is how bad. This is how I'm like Pavlov's dog. Well, see, I grew up next to an Italian bakery, so I was used to it. Every time they said something new, my mom would say, go get some bread. So, when you get older, the doctor tells you you shouldn't be eating your bread. You got to find a new doctor, So anyway, he talks about the sensible qualities, okay? So all of the things about bread, if you are like me, oh my Lord, I could just eat bread. So it's the smell, it's the taste, it's the texture. You break it apart and the steam that comes out. These are all sensible qualities of bread that we experience. So you don't need, we could all do that. If I did that here in the room, we would all experience that, right? But he talks about these secret powers, okay? And all he means is that it's nourishment. But we don't sense the nourishment, right? You and I, how did we, I know it's not the first time you've heard this, but how brave was the person who ate the first oyster? Think of that. Somebody saw that rock. First of all, figured out it wasn't a rock. Broke it open and saw that slimy goo and said, gee, I bet that looks good, So over time, people ate that and then realized either it didn't make them sick or it tasted good. But it was only from experience that they knew that. Did I tell you about the school I was at in the summer up in Maine, the lobsters? The same way.
The village, they stopped giving.
The prison, yeah, you can't, the same thing. Who saw that? Because, lobsters are red, they look attractive, but if anybody sees have you ever seen a crayfish in the wild, right? They're the same thing. They're like, brown slimy things, and you throw them in water and they get bright red. Well, somebody figured out in the beginning, hey, I got an idea, But it was over time that people probably sensed this. I'm sorry. It was over time of what they were able to sense that they associated with nourishment. So people realized, hey, look, we're catching these fish in the sea, we're eating them, and it's healthy for us. But you can't sense the nourishment that comes from those. He was calling that those secret powers. All we can ever sense are the things that we see and that we smell. And too, by the way, I have no idea what the Chinese food was. My daughter took Chinese language for 2 years. So they took her down to Philly, to little Chinatown, and they were making them eat things they could not eat. I mean, it was the sense thing. So it's like the reverse of this, right? So like when we see something that is outside of our appetite, like outside of our palate, we stay away from it because of what we associate with the senses. We have an experience associated with that. We have so it's perfectly nourishment. I mean, but we wouldn't sense that.
Wait, what's the secret power?
Secret power would be like the nourishment of the bread, right? So when you eat bread, it's good for you.
Oh, so you can't see it.
You can't see it. It's nowhere. What he's trying to say is that the sensible qualities, they are the cause. So we smell the bread, we taste the bread, we see the bread, we bite, you name it. The effect is that we get help from eating this. But there's no way that you could possibly know that effect always, or that cause always came from that effect. And here's how he would put it. What if, this happened over time. It was subsequent, happenings. So after like 1,000 times of people eating bread and nobody getting sick and it seemed to be nourishing, you know what? We've learned something. We've learned that bread is good for you. But we've only learned that through inductive reasoning for experience because we have not done this across the board. So if there's a way, I mean, sometimes, what was it? Like you ever see like, artificial food? Sometimes it looks so real, right? Now, the minute you pick it up, the weight might be different, right? So it's visually, it's dead on, but the weight might be different. Could you imagine if somebody had the artistic skills to make it so that it is identical, but it has zero nutritional value? Zero. They have figured out a way to manufacture this so that you can't tell the difference between real bread and fake bread. So you're going to eat it anyway.
Like 3D printing.
Well, I guess maybe a 3D printing, if they could do that and make it smell and taste. I don't know much about it. Are they able to do that? Well, okay, maybe, but still, there would be a nourishment there. I guess I'm trying to say this is totally fake, right? So we all know bread that may look like bread, but this guy's an artist. He made bread that looks like bread, tastes like bread, smells like bread, feels like bread, has the same color, texture, everything. Nailed it. But there's zero nutritional value because it's just made out of, God knows, maybe it's made out of fluff, who knows what. If we then started eating that, because we all would, we wouldn't think twice, because all our previous experiences have told us this is going to be nourishing for us. So we just start eating this. And over the course, here at Villanova, over the course of, say, 3 months, we're realizing, I get nothing from this. I get no nourishment. I seem to be, people are getting sick, and we realize there's zero secret powers within that bread. Somebody has basically been able to mimic every single sensible quality. Now what would we do? When we see the steaming bread, we probably would not be hungry for it anymore, because we've been conditioned in the opposite way. I think maybe that's what I was thinking with you. You could get unconditioned and then reconditioned for something else, right? It's almost like you can see like the behavioral aspects of this. So what he's trying to say is, what's different? Because the cause has not changed. Everything in the cause is still there. It has the same steam, the same smell, the same color, the same taste, the same texture, you name it. But the effect's no longer there. So what we were so sure that the effect always followed the cause, the cause always followed, such and myself, the effect followed the cause, we now know that that's not as certain as we might have thought. Another thing, you could do the same thing with a candle, right? Like, for instance, if they make these new candles now. Now, I know they don't look exactly like a flame, but they're close, right? They might dip the bulb in silicone. They might have like some flashy element to it and such. a child is never going to a priori know that a candle will hurt until the first time you touch it, right? And then the child will burn his finger. He now has an experience. And if the child does that 2 or 3 times, eventually that child is going to associate that candle with the experience of getting burned, right? So there's a cause that produces an effect. Now, if we can get that same artist to get us a candle, and maybe instead of like obviously a flame, we'll have some flickering LED light that's just as bright, just as convincing, but it's cool to the touch. You know if you put that there, the child's going to be hesitant to ever go near the damn thing. But maybe over time, because you would do it, oh look, it's nothing like that, you freak them out a little bit, and they think, oh my God, and then they eventually touch it, and they start laughing. Oh, now if you just did that for the next 3 years, you would disassociate that cause and effect within that individual. So he says, so then why are we always so certain that the effect always follows? He says, I'm not. We only have this as inductive reasoning. And he goes, what he comes down to, and his point is this, is that it's never necessary. It's only from past experiences that we assume this. But that's not really certain knowledge, is it? Now, again, even with like dropping the billiard ball, he's not silly. It's not like he's thinking one day it's going to go up. He's just saying you could imagine the opposite. You could imagine it. You can't imagine the opposite of 3 times 5, 15. I mean, you know 3 times 10 equals 15, you know that's wrong. So you can't imagine the opposite of that. But you could with this. So he says, you know, therefore, as long as I can imagine the opposite, I don't have that certainty. All I can say is it's happened every single time like this, and this can continue happening. And how many things in life do we probably actually do like this? We just don't really think about it per se. So, you know, you can see, now, if a person had this type of epistemological stance, do you see how his epistemological stance is going to fall out into reality? You're going to accept reality, although he's still not too far away from Descartes, where he says, look, you know, there's only so much we know about this exterior world. You know, my senses are real, but, you know, they're not infallible. I realize that. He says, but as far as what I can know from the exterior world, he says, all I can know is what's contingent on past experiences. And since I don't see any necessary necessary conjunction between a cause and an effect, I'm forever going to be in a certain amount of skeptical mode where what I see, I'm not so sure. And some of these things, I mean, did you ever see like those sidewalk artists that can do like 3D stuff on the sidewalk? It's kind of freaky. I mean, I know if it was me, I'd walk around it. I would think I'm going to fall in. And sometimes, you know, when you're up on these illusions, they're so real, even though you know it's an illusion, you're still not sure. It's like you don't want to chance it, right? Now, could you imagine if it was like some sort of world where you really did fall into that hole drawn on the ground? After time, you would then associate that, you know, cause and effect together, but you didn't earlier. And then Hume would step in and say, well, that's what I've been trying to tell you. There's no necessary connection between these two things. The only reason that you believe it's true is because it's always been that way in the past. But since you can see the opposite, it's not necessary, it's not that sure of information for you.
Could you say then that, like, not necessarily you have experience, but someone?
Well, he talks about that. But again, he's going to talk about the testimony. Did that person have all the experiences? So maybe you meet a biologist, and the biologist does tell you that this African bush elephant is the biggest elephant in the world. You need to ask him. You see them all.
Yeah, or like if your mom tells you like not to run the street, like you're gonna get hit by a car. Like I know not to do that. Like I've never like run the street, got hit by a car, but I still know that because like people are telling me.
You know, this is really cool you brought that up, because I think I might have shared it with you, because my wife and my kids were young. I had 2 little daughters. At one point they were like, what, 1, 3, and 5. And we didn't live on a busy street, but it was a school right across the street, so whatever. So my wife would be out there telling them, don't go in the street, cars bite. And I'd be sitting there going, you're going to mess these kids up, you know? Cars are biting. But her point was, and this is perfect, Hume would say, you got it, right? My wife said, I'm not going to have to go in the toilet, I'll give her a shout out here, you know? What child has an experience of being hit by a car? You just said that, you know? But the only way you would have that experience is if, like, I don't know, maybe you saw it on TV or something. But my wife sensed that there's no way the child's going to have an experience. But probably got bit if you have brothers or sisters or cousins, right? Everybody knows what it's like to get bit. That hurts. So the fact that you got bit and it hurts, guess what? Cars bite. But Hume said, yeah, the only way you're able to do that is because you took a previous experience. Now what he said, what you did was, you know, on this tabula rasa, you were able to take like the blue and the apple and put them together. You're able to take the pain of being bit or whatever, however you and you associate it with the car, you're able to put that together. But the only reason you're able to do that is because you've had previous experiences on both those incidents. If you took away, if a person had no experience on biting, like, I shouldn't say, my one daughter's friend, she was like a gamer. When I talk a gamer, like this is all she did, never went outside. And now we're talking 9 years old, and a lovely young kid, you know, so I'm not making fun. She's over our house, and we're pretty physical at our house, right? So I had like a ball, it was a heavier ball, like one of those like rubber kickballs or whatever, and I threw it to her. She didn't even move. It hit her chest and bounced off, and then she looked at me and she goes, "You hit me." I had no experience of ever, you know, giving a ball to somebody. They didn't like have a reflex, you know? So maybe you could take somebody like that, if somebody never experienced, I don't know, maybe you're raised in a home where you never had any idea what a bite might hurt, you would be thinking, well, food, I don't understand what you mean. You have to find something else in the experience. So that's probably a good way to understand this. This is how what we do probably with child development, right? We have to find analogies to work with them. In other words, you know, you don't have that experience, so allow me to give it to you. And if we can get something that they've experienced, then we're going to put something together and we'll conjoin those. But nonetheless, they're only certain until something else, because the reality is that, you know, I don't know, you'd have to envision a scenario where, you know, cars don't show damage or anything, and then they're going to start questioning whether or not they're true. And then Hume would say, well, that's only going to be necessary until you find it otherwise, that type of thing. So that's Hume's project, right? It kind of leaves you in a certain level of skepticism, but it also, you know, puts us to a level of thinking that a lot of philosophers have not really been able to overcome per se. People have tried, and you know, now what I think that he's on to something. I don't subscribe to it wholeheartedly, right? There's plenty of things. It's only because I'm willing to accept things as true that I don't experience. But I understand that. And if you're a religious person, you have to. I mean, you know, you're never going to, I mean, unless you saw it for yourself, you're kind of like locked in to accepting testimony. There's no other way about it. So any questions on this? All right, folks.